Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Timothy here with Mana Rocks, and this is part 2 of our Modern Horizons draft archetype breakdown, where we're going to look at the color pairs for Modern Horizons and get you ready for your first, maybe only draft of this set by kind of breaking down what each color pair is trying to do. Last time we talked about goblins and slivers, we talked about a couple other decks. This time we're going to talk about the less straightforward decks, the decks that aren't necessarily tribal decks or just, pretty easy to tell what you're doing decks like the snow thing. A lot of time, or in the previous video, we talked about a lot of archetypes where you kind of know exactly what kind of cards you want in your deck. If you're drafting goblins, you want goblins. If you're drafting snow, you want snow. These ones are a little bit sketchier. But before we get into the archetypes, first off, let me thank you for being here. Hope you liked the video, and I hope this helps you out if you're not going to be able to draft this set over and over again. You can subscribe below, or you can find us on Twitter at MTG_ManaRocks. And with all that being said, let's go ahead and jump into our first archetype, which ironically is kind of a tribal archetype. So black-white is occupying a very weird space here. The archetype is changelings, which sounds really weird because there are other tribal archetypes. We already talked about goblins and slivers, but then there's a bunch of other cards that have tribal payoffs, and their tribe just isn't really represented in the set. And you'll see what we mean here. You kind of get an idea of what black-white is trying to do with its uncommon. It's Etchings of the Chosen, 1 white and a black, 3 mana, for an enchantment that says when it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Those creatures you control get +1/+1, and you may pay a mana and sack a creature of the chosen type to give a creature indestructible until end of turn. What creature type are you choosing? I have no idea. It depends on what deck you have. Obviously, when you have a bunch of changelings in your deck, you can name any creature type, and that'll apply to all your changelings. So you're probably going to name the second most represented creature type in your deck besides changeling. Changeling is not a creature type you can name, so you'll name something like vampire or zombie or something like that. Whatever you have more of in your deck so that this becomes a real anthem. And obviously, this will work for every single changeling. When you're drafting black-white, you want a huge number of changelings, basically as many as you can get your hands on. And while there are changelings and ways to change creature types across different colors, black-white has the majority of them. Here, black-white gets a really strong spell that I think other decks will be interested in, but black-white will be able to use to maximum capacity more often. That's Return from Extinction. 1 in a black for a sorcery. You either return a creature from your graveyard to your hand, or you return 2 creatures with a common creature type from your graveyard to your hand. So 2 mana to get back 2 creatures from your graveyard to your hand is very good. We see this in card like Dead Revels. When you cast it for 2 mana, it's pretty good. Soul Salvage, stuff like that costs 3 mana is still pretty playable. But for 2 mana, this is a really strong effect. If you're only getting back 1 creature, this is, take it or leave it, not that great. But if you can reliably get back 2 creatures, this is going to be awesome. The cool things with changelings here is that as long as you're getting back 1 changeling, you can get back basically any other creature you want, because the changeling will share a creature type with whatever else you choose. So as long as you're getting back 1 changeling, this will always get back 2 creatures. There's also Valiant Changeling, which I think is just going to be a strong card in general, but in a dedicated Changeling deck, this card can be nuts. It's 5 white, 7 mana total for a 3/3 double striker. It's a Changeling itself, and it costs 1 less to cast for each creature type among the creatures you control on the battlefield. So if you have a knight and you have a goblin, this will cost 2 less. But if you have a changeling on board already, that's all creature types, and this will cast basically infinite less. You still have to pay white to cast the card, but if you have a changeling on board, you can cast this for white and get a 3/3 double striker. There is a very convoluted way to get this out on turn 2, but most often you can reliably get this out on turn 3 or 4. If you have enough changelings in your deck. And if you're kind of short on changelings, this will just count up all of your other creatures. A lot of creatures tend to have 2 creature types, and if you have, a human cleric and a goblin on board or something like that, and this costs 3 less, well, you're getting a pretty good discount. That would be a 4 mana 3/3 double striker, which is still a good card. As long as you're not paying 7 for this card, it's going to be quite good, but it'll be at its best in black-white. Now, there's some kind of a oddball card choices that are floating around these sets, and if you don't really understand like why changeling or what changeling is, or maybe you didn't really look at the set, you might see a card like King of the Pride or some of these other ones and be like, oh, cats is a thing, but it's really not. King of the Pride is 2 and a white for a 2/1 cat. Other cats you control get +2/+1. I don't actually even think there are any other actual cats in this set, so this might as well just say your other changelings get +2/+1, which is a really nice buff to some of the evasive changelings too. We have Undead Augur, which is black for a 2/2 zombie wizard, and it says whenever it or another zombie you control dies, you draw a card and lose a life. There are actually a couple other zombies, but it's not really well supported. There's maybe 2 to 3 more in the set, maybe a couple ways to make tokens. So this one can be a little bit of a standalone card, and it does work when it dies as well. So for black, you're getting a pretty good card, but with a bunch of changelings, being able to turn them into extra cards when they die is quite nice as well. Vampire card, we have Cordial Vampire is another black creature. This one's a rare and it's a 1/1, and whenever it or another creature dies, you put a 1/1 counter on each vampire you control. I don't actually think there are any other vampires in the set, maybe 1 or 2 at most, but being able to stick a counter on all your changelings whenever any vampire dies is really nice, and this one triggers on itself too. This is a little bit of a sketch rare here. I don't think you want to first pick this card, but a lot of other people don't want this card either, so if you end up going down the route of black-white, you can probably pick up these cats and vampires and zombies pretty late. And then one more card that's worth noting here is Scrapyard Recombiner. This is a 3 mana artifact creature. It's a 0/0 with modular 2, which isn't really the important part, but when it dies, you can stick its 2 counters on another artifact creature if you have one. Not a lot of artifact creatures in this set, but there are a couple cool things. The thing we really care about for this archetype is that it says tap, sacrifice an artifact, search your library for a construct card, reveal it, put it in your hand, and then shuffle your library. I actually, again, don't think there are any other constructs in this set, but, if you replace the word construct with changeling, it becomes a little bit more interesting, right? You can sacrifice any changeling, you can sacrifice any artifact, including the Recombiner itself, and you get to fetch up any changeling from your deck. So this can be a way to kind of get your silver bullet changelings, your 3/3 double striker or something like that. You do have to have artifacts to sacrifice, but the fact that it can sacrifice itself is already good enough. And I think these are all very unassuming cards for people who kind of haven't looked at the commons and uncommons. Sometimes people will go into their first draft knowing the big money mythics and stuff like that. And if they're not aware that, vampires, cats, and constructs aren't really supported archetypes here, they might miss out on the fact that changelings can take advantage of that. Next one here, black-green. This is going to be a value-based deck. It's basically graveyard matters, trying to eke out some sort of advantage by recurring things from your graveyard or getting things into your graveyard. Some of the payoffs here in the common, uncommon slot include things like Mother Bear, which can exile itself from the graveyard for 5 mana to create 2/2/2 bears. We also have things like First Sphere Gargantua with Unearth. I believe there's a sliver with Unearth as well that gives your other slivers Unearth. Just a good card that when you cast it has a pretty strong effect on the board, and then when it dies or whenever you mill it, you can Unearth it to get it back for a turn as well. And then things like Rank Officer, which lets you pitch cards to the graveyard to create creatures, and also lets you exile creatures out of your graveyard to drain your opponent for 2, or rather make each opponent lose 2 life. So a recurable way to use creatures in your graveyard to attack your opponent's life total. There are sacrifice outlets as well, including cards like Carrion Feeder, which can let you get kind of expendable creatures into your graveyard. There's an interesting one, also a zombie. Note that Carrion Feeder, also a zombie. Silumgar Scavenger, however, zombie bird, is a 5 mana, 4 and a black for a 2/3 flyer with exploit, which is just a fancy way of saying you can choose to sacrifice another creature if you want to when it enters the battlefield. And then whenever any other creature you control dies, whether you exploited it or not, the scavenger will get a +1/+1 counter, and it'll get haste if it exploited. Kind of weirdly worded, but it just gets a counter whenever another creature you control dies, and it gains haste that first time if you exploit a creature when this enters the battlefield. So this one can get pretty big. Same with Carrion Feeder. Turning your onboard presence into one big attacker while also getting these Graveyard Matters cards into your graveyard. And then you have cards like Spore Frog, which just naturally get themselves into the graveyard. Basically, if it's a creature and it has the word graveyard written on it, or it sacrifices itself or lets you sacrifice other creatures, it's probably playable in this archetype. There's also some fancy instants or sorceries like Winding Way, Ransack the Lab, and Glacial Revelation that lets you fuel your graveyard synergies, all in different ways. Winding Way lets you pick either creature or land, get all of those in the top 4 to your hand, and put the rest in the graveyard. Ransack is kind of like an Anticipate that puts the extra cards into the graveyard. And then we talked about Glacial Revelation a couple times in the previous video, where if you're not playing a lot of snow permanents, this is just a way to mill yourself for a bunch. Definitely better in the blue-green snow archetype where it's actually like a draw 6 or something along those lines, but here, a mill 6 could be what your deck wants. I would stick to the first two, Winding Way and Ransack the Lab, but it's worth noting that Glacial Revelation does have its place in this archetype. And then it's worth noting that some of the busted things you can do here with some of the rares include Genesis. Genesis is just an extremely strong, overpowering card for any deck that wants to go late or makes it past the mid game. If you can stabilize against an aggro deck, then Genesis can grind out the opponent. It's just a very potent effect on a card and really hard to interact with. There's also Deep Forest Hermit, which is probably one of the best rares in the entire set from first glance. It just puts so much power and toughness on board. And if you're able to rebuy, per se, the Deep Forest Hermit, put it back on the battlefield, and maybe keep casting it or find a way to recur it multiple times, you should have no problem winning that game. There's also the gold uncommon I want to talk about, Rot Widow pack. It's 2 black and a green, so 4 mana total. You're getting a 2/4 reach spider, so pretty big butt, and reach is nice against some of the aggro flyers. And for 5 mana, 3 black green, you can exile a creature from your graveyard, create a 1/2 green spider token with reach, and then each opponent loses a life for each spider you control. So assuming you control this, and then you make a spider, each opponent's going to lose 2, and then the next time you activate, they're going to lose 3. Meanwhile, you're building up an army of reach creatures. And anyone who's played with Spider Spawning knows that a bunch of 1/2 reach creatures can clog up a board really quickly. Rot Widow pack seems like a huge payoff for being in this archetype. Yes, it fits in the Changeling archetype as well if they're splashing, since all of those Changelings will be spiders. But if you end up with this card, you can prioritize a couple of Changelings yourself as well. Blue-red has an interesting theme here. Basically, it's blue-red draw cards, right? It's not really a control deck as much as it is like an aggro deck or, an aggro tempo deck or something along those lines. But it has a specific theme of the second card you draw each turn mattering. The uncommon marquee card here is Thundering Djinn, 5 mana, 3/4 flyer that when it attacks deals damage to any target equal to the number of cards you've drawn this turn. On base level, that'll almost always do at least 1 damage unless something crazy is happening. But if you have a bunch of card draw spells or you've, cycled or something along those lines, this can actually just shoot down creatures. So seems like a pretty strong card. But we're looking more specifically at cards like Spinehorn Minotaur, the 3 mana 2/3 that gets double strike if you've drawn 2 or more cards, and Ikite, which is a 2 mana 1/2 flyer that gets +2/+0 as long as you've drawn 2 or more cards that turn. Super aggressive creatures for their mana cost. 3 mana 2/3 double strike and a 2 mana 3/2 flyer. These are both very powerful cards, especially at common, and all you need to do to make them reach their full potential is make sure that you have ways to draw extra cards each turn, at least 1 extra card. There's a plethora of card draw in this set, but you're looking for recurable ways turn after turn to make sure you can at least hit your second draw. Cards like Everdream with Splice that can go ahead and splice a card draw into any other instant or sorcery is a good way to make sure that you're always hitting that extra card each turn. Scour All Possibilities gives you 2 shots at card draw. Having Scry 2 draw a card for 2 mana and then flashing it back the turn after means that you're going to be able to fulfill this condition at least 2 turns. Letting your Ikite attack for 3 for at least 2 turns off of just 1 card. And then something like, Hollow Head Sliver the power toughness doesn't matter here. Being a sliver doesn't matter too much, but all of your slivers get to rummage. They get to tap to discard a card and draw a card. You know, these are the type of things you're looking for. Basically, you'll just play all of the draw spells you can get a hold of, and there's a lot of them, but in particular, you're looking for ways to make sure that you're always drawing a card turn after turn, not just one-shot effects, right? A couple things I want to note here. There are a few cards that are built into this archetype to be a lot better here than they are in other archetypes. The first one is Fists of Flame. It's 1 and a red for an instant. It says draw a card, and until end of turn, target creature gains trample and gets +1/+0 for each card you've drawn this turn. So, assuming that you're casting this on your own turn, you've already drawn a card for turn and this cantrip, so this is given at least +2/+0 in trample, which is okay. But if you have a busted version of this deck, maybe with the mythic rare wheel or something, and you're able to draw a bunch of extra cards per turn, this can actually put out a huge amount of damage. It does get worse on your opponent's turn. It is definitely an aggro card, not a defensive combat trick, and I think it gets worse in the other red archetypes like goblins and things like that. So if you end up in blue-red and you need kind of a big punch and you have a way to draw a bunch of extra cards, this could be something to keep your eye out for. And then there's the Squid Illusion, Oneiriophage. I don't know if that's how it's pronounced or not, but I'm going to call it Oneiriophage. 3 and a blue, 4 mana for an uncommon 1/2 flyer. 4 mana, 1/2 flyer. Whenever you draw a card, put a +1/+1 counter on it. If you've ever played with the Lore Scale Quaddle, you know that these cards can get out of hand very quickly, and all it takes is a couple draws before this becomes a huge threat. Obviously, 1/2 flyer for 4 is very much behind par, and you need to make sure you don't die when you're just sticking this on turn 4. So against an aggro deck, this can be a lot worse, but it also gets out of hand very quickly. By the time you untap for your next turn, draw for a turn, and then cast some sort of cantrip, it's already probably a 3/4 flyer and probably bigger than that as well. And then I also wanted to give a little shout out here to the cyclers again. You know, the cycling lands are just going to be good in any archetype. Basically, any deck is going to want to play at least 1 to 2 to 3, somewhere around that line. They're going to play a bunch of cycling lands. It just makes the game smoother. It makes flood out not as big as a problem. But in this archetype in particular, they have an extra bonus of fueling your cards that care about drawing an extra card. So all of your cycling lands will guarantee that you have a way to hit your second card on the turn that you cycle. Next one, I heard someone call this creature fall, so I'm going to use that terminology. It seemed kind of dumb to just call it green-white creatures, but the idea here is that you're getting paid off for making sure that you're having a creature enter the battlefield each turn, which is really weird. I don't know a more elegant way to say that, but creature fall makes sense. You know, landfall triggers when you play lands. Your quote-unquote creature fall abilities trigger when you play creatures. So your big payoffs here, and there's a couple other I left off, but you have Saddled Rhymestag, a 2-mana 2/2 that gets +2/+2 if you had another creature enter the battlefield that turn. You have Zalfirin Decoy, which becomes a tapper if you had a creature enter the battlefield that turn. And then you have things like Answered Prayers, which is an enchantment that becomes a 3/3 flyer if you had a creature, or whenever a creature enters the battlefield. So you kind of see where they're going with this. They want you to make sure that you're constantly having creatures hit the board, and then you get these extra little bonuses off of these cards. And I think there's maybe like a common 4/4 that gets bigger if you had a creature enter the battlefield. So these are your payoffs as far as repeatable ways to make sure creatures are entering the battlefield. There's a couple. You have things like Squirrel Nest, which is just a great card in and of itself. Basically says sacrifice a land and you make a squirrel for every turn of the game. Doesn't exactly say that, but you get to give one of your lands the ability to tap to make squirrels, and that's just a consistent way to make sure you always have a way to get a creature on board. 1/1 squirrels add up to, and there's actually a Squirrel Lord in this set too, which is kind of funny. There's Birthing Boughs, which is a 3-mana artifact. You can pay 4 and tap it to make a 2/2 shapeshifter creature token with Changeling. So this is a card that seems like it's going to be the backbones of a bunch of different decks, even though it's a little bit clunky and expensive. If you can't get your hands on something like a Squirrel Nest, then a Birthing Boughs might do the trick for you. And then there's also Recruit the Worthy, 1 white mana with buyback for 3. And the effect is you get a 1/1 white soldier creature token. So for 1 white mana, you get a 1/1, but you can buy it back and put it back in your hand for 3 extra mana. So 4 mana to guarantee that you're always getting a 1/1 each turn. Not the most efficient thing, not as good as Squirrel Nest, but it gets the job done and makes sure that all of your things that care about having creatures enter the battlefield will be able to do that turn after turn, and this can build a little army on its own. You've also got a couple interesting things that aren't necessarily always repeatable, but you have Treetop Ambusher, which is a dash creature. If you haven't played with dash, that just means you can pay the dash cost instead of its normal cost, and the creature will gain haste, but then it'll bounce back to your hand at the end of the turn. So it lets you kind of get that swing in right away or get the creature down right away, but you have to bounce it back at the end of the turn. The point here being that dash lets you just make sure you have a way to repeatedly cast that same creature turn after turn. There's Trumpet and Herd, which looks like a very powerful common to me. It's 2 green for a sorcery. It makes a 3/3 elephant creature token, and it has rebound, so you get to cast it 1 more time on your next upkeep. So basically, this will give you a 3/3 the turn you cast it, and a 3/3 the next turn, so that's 2 triggers on all of your creature fall abilities and creatures. And then obviously things like Battle Screech, anything that can, make multiple instances of creatures enter in the battlefield. In this case, Battle Screech makes 2 1/1 flyers, and then you can flash it back either the same turn or wait to make sure that you're fulfilling your creature fall requirement by flashing it back on a different turn, similar to Trumpet and Herd. I do want to say that the gold cards are a little bit of a miss for this archetype. The rare is Eladamri's Call, which is a green and a white instant to search your library for a creature and put it in your hand. I get it. That's probably something they wanted to go ahead and put into Modern. It's just not a super powerful card. Tutoring for a creature is not laughable. It's not completely embarrassing. It just doesn't necessarily fit the archetype well. It does make sure you have a creature coming into play the next turn, but not super impressive. And then the uncommon does pump all of your creatures. It gives them 1/1 counters when they enter the battlefield, but it doesn't ensure that you're constantly playing creatures, which I think is what the archetype wants to be doing. I think you wanted something that can continuously make creatures, but, a way to pump those creatures is nice too. And then our final archetype to talk about is the blue-white blink deck or flicker deck, and that's layman's terms for saying remove a creature and then put it back on the battlefield. You blink it, it goes away, it comes back. The absolute, I think, must-have card for this archetype is Soul Herder. I'm willing to bet this archetype lives or dies based on whether it has this card. In fact, the archetype doesn't really do too much without this card, or at least the payoffs aren't quite as powerful as what some of the other archetypes are doing. Soul Herder is 3 mana. It's 1 white and a blue for a 1/1, and it says whenever a creature is exiled from the battlefield, put a 1/1 counter on it. So that's kind of neat, right? But how are you going to exile creatures? Well, at the beginning of your end step, you may exile another target creature you control, then return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control. So it's a Conjurer's Closet. It blinks one of your other creatures on your end step, and that will trigger the first ability and put a +1/+1 counter on Soul Herder. So assuming you play this and you immediately get to blink something on your end step, it will get a counter right away on that end step. So it's almost like a 3 mana 2/2, which isn't as bad as a 3 mana 1/1. And then you get to do this turn after turn. The other card to kind of keep in mind here is Astral Drift. It's a 3 mana enchantment, and while it's on board, whenever you cycle a card, you get to blink a creature. I believe it only blinks your creatures. No, you can blink any creature. Check that out. You can also cycle the Astral Drift itself, which will give you 1 blink. But this is kind of a situational Soul Herder. Soul Herder will just work turn after turn after turn, whereas Astral Drift needs you to be cycling cards. So if you draft an Astral Drift, you have to make sure you have cycling cards in your deck as well to make it really good. The one-shot effect is just not going to be super impressive. These two cards do work together very nicely. And obviously what you're doing with this archetype is trying to take some powerful enter the battlefield trigger and reuse it to kind of, out-tempo your opponent. Mana War being kind of the standout card here. Every time it enters the battlefield, you get to bounce one of your opponent's creatures or kill some token they've made or reset some creature with counters on it, so on and so forth. So if you get to, Soul Herder every end step, targeting a mana war, that's just going to make it very difficult for your opponent to stay in the game. Meanwhile, Soul Herder is going to start getting bigger and you're going to start bashing. You just basically outvalue your opponent is how these blink decks tend to work when they're in limited. Couple neat things or a couple creatures that you're really looking to flicker here. There's Watcher for Tomorrow. I believe we talked about this in the previous video. It's 2 mana, 2/1 that lets you exile one of the top 4 cards of your library when it enters the battlefield, and then when it leaves the battlefield, you get to put that card into your hand. And notice that's a leaves the battlefield trigger, so there's not really any stopping that. If you blink it, it's going to leave the battlefield, you're going to get the hideaway card, and then it's going to come back into play, and you get to hide away another card. So there's an engine to be had there if you can continuously exile it or flicker it. There's also Vesperlark, which is a 3 mana 2/1 flyer with another leaves the battlefield trigger. In this case, you get to put a creature with power 1 or less from your graveyard onto the battlefield. Not a ton of those floating around, but if you can build your deck to the point where Vesperlark is really good, maybe you have some value 1 power creatures in your deck or something along those lines, and you're able to continuously blink your Vesperlark, then things can actually get pretty out of hand there. And then it's also worth noting Martyr's Soul, 2 and a white for a 3/2 with Convoke. That means you can tap your creatures to help pay for the mana costs. We've played with this recently. Most people, I think, know how Convoke works. And it's got a goofy enter the battlefield trigger. If you have no tapped lands when it enters the battlefield, you put 2+1/+1 counters on it. So if you just pay 3 mana using your lands, it's just going to be a 3/2 because you have tapped lands. So you got to find some cute way to put it on the battlefield without using your lands to pay for it. And one such way to do that is to just blink it with one of the cards we'll talk about in a second, and then have it enter the battlefield through that effect without tapping any of your lands. Obviously, you can just Convoke this thing out too, tap 3 creatures, have it come in, and boom, 5/4 for 3. But it's something I wanted to go ahead and mention for the archetype. You have Settle Beyond Reality is probably the key common for this archetype. Probably a good card for any white deck. I don't expect that this should go very late, so it's not like some of the other archetypes where you're going to get rewarded by getting this late. It's just a good removal spell, and I think most white decks will be interested in it. It's just going to be at its best if it ends up in a blue-white deck with Soul Herder. It's 5 mana. You choose one or both, exile a creature you don't control, and then blink a creature you do control. So you get to just straight up use this as removal to take out your opponent's best creature, and then if you want to, you can blink one of your own creatures and do basically everything we've already talked about for this archetype. Just in addition to that, you get to kill your opponent's best creature. 5 mana, clunky sorcery. It gets the job done as far as removal goes, but it's got an extra little added bonus if you're able to take advantage of that flicker. And then there's also Ephemerate, which is a single white mana for an instant that basically cloud shifts. It does the blink thing. You exile a creature you control, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. This one has rebound, which means you get to do it again on the next upkeep 1 additional time. So Ephemerate, Settle Beyond Reality, these are kind of your common ways to make sure you have ways in your deck to just blink your own creatures. Neither of them are like super powerful, but they get the job done. I think Ephemerate will be fine too. You can wait to use it as a protection spell, and it can protect your Soul Herder. It will reset the +1/+1 counters, but like I said, this archetype really, I think, needs Soul Herder in order to be really good. Otherwise, you're just kind of blinking to no real end. Soul Herder is actually, inevitability. It's the win con. Just blinking a mana war over and over again is annoying, but if you can't turn that into a win somehow, then it's not really going to cut it. One last card to talk about here, Blizzard Strix. This is a 5 mana 3/2 flyer with flash and fly-in, and when it enters the battlefield, if you control another snow permanent, you can exile any other permanent besides Blizzard Strix and then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So this can exile your opponent's creatures, or if you happen to be playing a blue-white deck that has a bunch of snow lands, or maybe just incidentally has other snow creatures or snow permanents, then Blizzard Strix can be a flash way or an instant speed way similar to Ephemerate. to blink your own creatures, and it just kind of fits into the archetype. It's not an overpowered card by any means, but it does kind of fit here equally to fitting in this snow deck. So I wanted to go ahead and mention it as a card that you should be on the lookout for if you end up in a blue-white deck with some snow permanents. And that's going to go ahead and do it for our Modern Horizons archetypes. There are some other interesting things you can do. Maybe there's some artifact decks floating around, but I didn't talk about a lot of the mythics because they seem like just powerful standalone cards. We don't need to talk about how good Seasoned Pyromancer and Urza and Yawgmoth are. They're just really good, but they don't actually do too much for their individual archetypes. In fact, some of them don't really have archetypal synergies at all. They're just overpowered commander cards that happen to be in this set. So if I didn't talk about a specific card, it's not because it's bad or it's not because it doesn't fit into one of these archetypes. I just wanted to make sure that anyone who's drafting has kind of a framework for what the different color pairs are trying to do. That way, you know, if they're paying $30 for their first draft, they're able to capitalize on that and they have an idea of what to expect going in. Overall, I would say the archetypes seem pretty balanced. The ones we talked about in this video, I think, are going to be a little bit more skill intensive. I mean, you'll know when Slivers is open, you'll know when Goblins is open, but it might be hard to tell when Changelings is open or when a green-black Synergy deck is getting past your way, or when a, I don't know, Creature Fall deck is getting past your way. I don't know. It'll be a little bit interesting, and I hope you all do well. But that's going to go ahead and cut it for this video. Thanks for hanging out with me. I hope this has been useful. You can let me know in the comments below whether it's been useful, or if I missed anything, feel free to let me know that as well. Feel free to give the video a like, subscribe to the channel if you want, and find us on Twitter at mtg_manarocks. All right, good luck with your Modern Horizons drafts. I will be drafting some Moto for Modern Horizons, probably Phantom events, in anticipation of a GP in Washington, D.C. in about a week. So wish me luck with that. Hope to hear from you all soon. Thanks for watching. My name's Timothy here with Manarocks. See you next time.